A push for a negotiated resolution to the Venezuelan crisis is picking up steam, we can report. Representatives of President Nicolas Maduro and opposition leader Juan Guaido are expected to meet for a second round of talks in Norway next week. The return to the negotiating table comes despite the earlier hawkish stance of some Western leaders. Next today, Igor Zhdanov looks then at what could be behind America's apparent easing of plans for any potential military intervention.
I swear to formally assume the duties of the national executive as President of Venezuela.
And that was how it all began. A long and potholed road to the chaos and mayhem Venezuela's in today. A once niche local politician, overnight shot into political stardom. And with the US on his side, it seemed Juan Guaido simply couldn't lose.
Hola. I'm Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States. The United States supports the courageous decision.
Many more countries followed suit.
Brazil has just issued a note recognizing Juan Guaido as Venezuela's president.
Juan Guaido.
Juan Guaido.
Juan Guaido.
Juan Guaido.
Juan Guaido.
Señor Guaido.
Señor Juan Guaido.
Venezuela began to devour itself from the inside. Torn by protests, streets flooded, people en masse reassuring Maduro of their support or venting their anger at a president they call a dictator. Meanwhile, Washington unrolled its arsenal. From threats to sanctions to even seemingly harmless things like aid, it tried to tip the balance of power in favor of their man, Guaido.
I wish him a long, quiet retirement on a pretty beach far from Venezuela, and the sooner he takes advantage of that, the sooner he's likely to have a nice, quiet retirement on a pretty beach rather than being in some other beach area like Guantanamo.
An unconventional holiday, but among the mildest ideas in America's rhetoric.
All options are on the table.
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 All options are on the table because they always are.
But with all that commotion in Guaido's camp, what of Maduro? The incumbent leader was willing to go all unconventional too, trying to articulate his readiness to talk it out with his new rival.
I am committed to international dialogue. Today, tomorrow, and always. I'm committed and personally ready.
But back then, Guaido was feeling too good to grace his arch-nemesis. Confronted with a blatant refusal, Maduro clung to the second best thing he had and has, apart from the support of a good share of his people, the military. It stood strong with Maduro, despite Guaido and Washington's efforts to encourage defection. The president imposter tried to make it look like things were going his way.
The armed forces are standing behind the people and the Constitution.
But very soon, his boastful overstatement was clear. Desertions were sporadic, local, and way below the critical mass needed to have Maduro worried. And all that leads us here, to a complete stalemate. Guaido has won the battle for the hearts and minds on Capitol Hill, for the embassies, for the right to be called President of Venezuela on the diplomatic papers of third-party countries, but not his own.
Would you like to see them intervene militarily?
I, as President in charge of the National Parliament, will evaluate all necessary options.
However cautious it may be, an official evaluation of an international intervention is as good as an open call for one. But with the US no longer looking as trigger-happy as before, Guaido has sent his emissaries to talk with Maduro. No longer too good for that. And the US, apparently once confident a quick power play would lead to victory, now has learned that OLA doesn't elect presidents.
Igor Zhdanov there. Well, something Washington appeared to be harder to convince about a peaceful resolution to the Venezuelan crisis, though. Talking of which, former presidential hopeful and staunch war hawk, Senator Lindsey Graham, who's urged Donald Trump to take inspiration from an earlier US invasion.
Maduro is not the legitimate leader of Venezuela. He wouldn't be in power without 6,000 or 7,000 Cuban security forces in Venezuela. I would do exactly what Reagan did. I would give Cuba an ultimatum to get out of Venezuela. If they don't, I would let the Venezuelan military know you got to choose between democracy and Maduro. And if you choose Maduro and Cuba, we're coming after you.
Under President Reagan, U.S. forces invaded the Caribbean nation of Grenada back in 1983, is what he's talking about there. They claimed back then it was to thwart a Cuban military takeover, but the U.S. allegedly also exaggerated evidence that American civilians were in danger there. Now, though, Senator Graham may be overlooking some pretty glaring differences between present-day Venezuela and Grenada back in the 1980s. For starters, the size. Grenada's geographically much smaller than Venezuela, making it easier to access and control. In 1983, its population stood at just 96,000. Take Venezuela now, though, it's 32 million population living there. Back then, the US deployed 6,000 troops. Today, a military intervention in Venezuela would require an estimated 150,000 troops. Author Dan Kovlik says an intervention today would prove to be a total disaster.
The idea that the US is going to be able to knock off the Venezuelan government, Grenada style, is just silliness. Of course, the U.S. could try a military option. From the U.S. point of view, it would be a disaster. It would be a very protracted military struggle. Europe would, in the end, not support it. I think most South American countries would not support it. Even, apparently, the military of Brazil. I think the U.S. would stand alone. And I think diplomatically it would be a disaster for the U.S., and it could be a disaster in many other ways. Again, if the U.S. got sunk into another Vietnam-type war, it would cause deaths, of course, of U.S. personnel, would cost trillions of dollars of Treasury, and may cause rebellion within the United States against the government, as we saw during the Vietnam War. So it's a very, very risky proposition for the U.S. to do this.